All right, good afternoon, everyone. It is 1 p.m. on the East Coast of the US, so it is C-Star time. My name is Markus Christensen, and I'm happy to welcome our in-person and online audience to the third presentation of the 10th season of the C-Star Lecture Series. Now, before hearing from today's speaker, I want to alert you to our talk in 2 weeks' time. We had a last-minute change in the schedule. Our very own Dr. Nicholas Riccardi, who's a part of the C-Star team, has stepped in and will present his work using deep learning-based drainage as a biomarker of post-stroke language recovery in 2 weeks' time. Today, however, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Peter Turkeltaub, Professor of Neurology and Rehabilitation Medicine at Georgetown University Medical Center. Dr. Turkeltaub, who is well known among many of our viewers, is a cognitive neurologist and neuroscientist who specializes in aphasia and neurorehabilitation and the brain basis of language. His research aims to reveal brain mechanisms underlying aphasia and alexia in order to improve diagnosis and treatment. He earned an MD and PhD in neuroscience from Georgetown University and completed his neurology residence and cognitive neurology fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Turkeltaub directs the Cognitive Recovery Lab and the NIH-funded Neuroscience of Language Training Program at Georgetown University and the Aphasia Clinic at MedStar National Rehabilitation Hospital, as well as serving as the administrative PI of the Stroke Central Atlantic Network for Research. And today, he'll share some of his work on constrained right hemisphere plasticity in aphasia and opportunity to improve recovery. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat during the presentation for him to answer at the end of his talk. And with that, I'll give the floor over to you, Peter.
Oh, thank you, Sigfus. I appreciate that kind introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. Before I start, I just want to say how excited I am at all the amazing things happening at the University of South Carolina. In case they haven't advertised it widely enough, there are, I think, 7 open faculty positions, and they're building a new hospital and all kinds of amazing things that'll bring progress, I'm sure, for people with aphasia going on there. So thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is the question of right hemisphere recovery in aphasia. I don't have any real disclosures except for funding sources, which are the funding for the projects I'm showing are bolded, and then the others are just other funding sources. And before I start, I just want to acknowledge my team. This is my lab, the Cognitive Recovery Lab, the greatest lab on the planet, I think. And in particular, my colleagues Andrew DeMarco, Kelly Martin, Alicia Lux, and Laura Skipper-Kalal, who contributed to the projects that I'm going to focus on today, along with Alyssa Newport, who leads the perinatal and now pediatric stroke project team at Georgetown, of which I'm lucky to be a collaborator, along with Anna Greenwald, Bill Gaillard, and Catherine Chompers, who are key members of that team as well. Sigfus mentioned our training program, so here's the website for that, neurolying.georgetown.edu. We fund PhD students in neuroscience and postdocs across, I think it's now 16 labs at Georgetown who study neuroscience of language. So please take a look at that if you're interested in joining us. All right, so we're going to talk about aphasia. I think everybody on this call is probably familiar with this, but I'll go through it anyway, just in case. So aphasia is an acquired language deficit that's usually caused by left hemisphere damage or dysfunction. In our cohort, the lesions look like this. Stroke is the most common cause, and about 1/3 of all people who have a stroke wind up with aphasia. Most commonly, it's the MCA distribution as shown on the picture on the right, but strokes elsewhere in the left hemisphere and every so often in the right hemisphere will also cause aphasia. It affects a lot of people. Best estimates are 1 to 2 million people at any given time in the US have aphasia. So that's more, for instance, than Parkinson's disease. And we know that even accounting for other stroke deficits, it reduces independence and quality of life. And unfortunately, speech therapy is the only proven treatment for aphasia, so we all want better treatments. Now, one of the things I'm not going to talk about much today, but I did want to touch on briefly is social determinants of health. And so social determinants of health play a big role in the degree to which people can recover from aphasia. They affect brain health before the time of stroke. They affect access to acute stroke care, access to rehabilitative services, access to community resources that allow reintegration into the community. And I might get emotional for a minute here. So we had in our group for 4 years, Dr. Celeste Gadsden, who made it her life's work to lift up Black stroke survivors with aphasia, who as a group suffer some of the worst disparities in social determinants of health. And as I think many of you know, we lost Celeste earlier this year due to complications of leukemia. And I was lucky enough to bring to publication her, what I think is her last paper. She had written this about 2 years before she passed away with my help. And it was a long path to publication. She was still tweaking it in the hospital before she passed away. And it was just recently, a week or two ago, published in Aphasiology in as close a form to the last version that I had as I could do. And so I would just ask that you all read this and see Celeste's legacy for the field. I put a QR code up here. This is for our lab's tribute page to Celeste, which has some more information about her. It has a link to this paper, and it has a couple of ways that if you feel so moved, you can contribute to Celeste's legacy. Okay, so back to aphasia recovery. So one of the difficulties we face for people with aphasia is that recovery is variable. So this is from a seminal paper by Stephen Wilson, published a couple of years ago, looking at the longitudinal trajectory of stroke outcomes across a number of different behaviors with people grouped by lesion size and location. And what this paper shows is that recovery is variable in a number of ways. First, the initial deficits, as many of us are aware, are very highly related to stroke location and size. The pattern of deficits is as well, and the course of recovery is affected by lesion size and location, and recovery proceeds differently for different aspects of language. This is from an older paper showing something similar in a smaller group of people. Another thing to note about these figures is that aphasia recovery is limited, and recovery rates depend on how you define aphasia, how you measure it, but the basic fact is that most people who start with aphasia can't return to all of their pre-stroke activities. They're permanently limited in some way related to communication. And there's no amount or no quality of speech therapy that can cure aphasia. And for my taste, it's important to study all aspects of care for aphasia, but our long-term goal should be to try to cure aphasia. And we're not close to that right now. So the reason for that is that adults lack sufficient brain plasticity to recover fully. So maybe we can take inspiration from a group of humans who do have sufficient brain plasticity to recover from a stroke. I'll give you 1 second to think about who that might be. It's these guys. So these are my babies. They're not babies anymore. In fact, the one on the left, he's turning 15 today. The one on the right is turning 17 in two weeks. So I think we all know that babies have a great deal of brain plasticity. And my colleague, Alyssa Newport, over the past several years has led a team that have shown sort of the boundaries of this. So there's a surprising number of infants who have a stroke at the time of birth, an ischemic stroke that can sometimes take out an entire hemisphere. And what happens is that babies can lose the entire left hemisphere. We have some cases in our cohort who have lost their entire left hemisphere, and they acquire normal language. And the way they do that is by acquiring language in the right hemisphere. And so here, this is a group map of control subjects. These are all people who have grown up. They're teenagers and adults. So we're looking at the endpoint of development. The blue are sibling controls who are using a typical left hemisphere language network to do this sentence processing fMRI task. And the orange are the kids who grew up after a left hemisphere perinatal stroke. And what you can see is that they have acquired normal language. In this group, the language tested equivalent to their sibling controls, and they do it using this mirror image network in the right hemisphere. And this is a universal finding when you have a stroke of a certain size in the left hemisphere. Small strokes may not behave the same way, but these are all kids who lost about a third or more of the MCA distribution, and they all use the right hemisphere successfully. So, thought experiment, what if we could make adults do this? It seems like an unreachable goal, but science is improving all the time. There's great animal model research on reopening critical periods of plasticity. And so I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility in this century, let's say, to make this actually happen. And so to get there, we need to understand what's happening in adults right now with the right hemisphere. And so when I was a wee babe, a fellow in Roy Hamilton's group, I did this meta-analysis of the literature at the time. This is from 2010 probably is when I did this. And so these are consistent areas of activity in control subjects in blue and in people with chronic aphasia in orange for a set of language tasks. And you may look at this and think, wow, actually, adults are a lot like babies. They're using the right hemisphere. And this is an unfortunate side effect of what is otherwise an amazing meta-analysis technique. Because in fact, the differences that resulted in this pattern of findings were actually quite subtle. So if you look at the activation foci that went into this analysis, in the control participant, 60% were in the left hemisphere and 40% in the right. And in the people with aphasia, 52 versus 48. And remember, there's lesions in the left hemisphere, so there'll be less activity in the left hemisphere. And so these are really subtle changes, but consistent when you look over a series of studies. And so the way to interpret this paper is that there may be some role of the mirror image right hemisphere language network in adults with aphasia, but it's a very small change compared to the typical pattern of activity. Another finding from this paper was that most of the right hemisphere activity were in people with left frontal lesions. And that's a finding that we've replicated and that Dorothy Sauer's group has replicated as well. Now, Stephen Wilson followed up with a really important meta-analysis using a technique that allowed him to include a wider range of studies a few years ago. And what he found was that there was widely decreased activity in the left hemisphere for people with aphasia, and maybe a little bit of increased activity in the right hemisphere. But this finding was borderline and the borderline significant in the right hemisphere. And Stephen pointed out that a lot of the tasks that were used in the studies that resulted in this finding had some confounds in them. And in particular, one of the things that he and I at the time also worried about was that some of this activity might relate to differences in task effort on fMRI tasks. People with aphasia will struggle to perform fMRI tasks, language tasks, more than control subjects, and increased effort on fMRI tasks results in greater activity everywhere, including in these right hemisphere areas. And so this may simply be an artifact of task performance. Now, there's another important finding about the right hemisphere that I think many people are familiar with from this seminal paper by Dorothy Sauer, which tracked longitudinal fMRI activity for a sentence comprehension task over time in a group of people. And what they found was that there was a time in the subacute period where the right hemisphere activity, particularly in the frontal lobe, seemed to be increased. But in the chronic period, it had come back down to baseline levels and was essentially the same as what you see in control subjects. So there's an idea out there in the literature based on this paper primarily that the right hemisphere may be important for a time after a stroke, but that in the long run, it doesn't contribute much to aphasia recovery in adults. All right, so what happened over the course of development where babies can use the right hemisphere very effectively and very robustly to support language, but adults can't? Well, we looked at this, we started to look at this in a paper, a cross-sectional paper, looking at language activity during a sentence comprehension task. Alyssa Newport is the PI of this study. And looking cross-sectionally at changes in language activity over time. So this is 4 representative participants from different age groups. And what you can see is the left hemisphere activity doesn't really change much over the course of development, but the right hemisphere activity decreases over age, such that it's not very high at all in the adult group. And this was particularly true in the right frontal lobe. Now, a very astute and excellent PhD student, Kelly Martin, who's now a postdoc at the University of Pittsburgh with Marlene Berman, went under the hood here and said, well, what if we ignore the magnitude of activity and look at the pattern of activity in the right hemisphere? And what she found was that if you ignore how high the activity is, but just look at the location of the right hemisphere activity, even though it's lower, doesn't really change over the course of development. And so she coined this the weak shadow of early life language in the right hemisphere. And this figure shows the symmetric areas of activity. So it's shown on a left hemisphere, but the hotspots are places where the activity in the right hemisphere, ignoring the magnitude, the peaks of activity, are symmetric with the left hemisphere. Now, they're fairly symmetric, but the right hemisphere activity in this paper was not a perfect mirror image of the left hemisphere. People's left hemisphere activity was more similar to other people's left hemisphere activity than the right hemisphere was to the left hemisphere, if that makes sense. So the weak shadow is fairly symmetric, but it's not a perfect mirror image. And that leads to a hypothesis about right hemisphere plasticity after a left hemisphere stroke. So here's one of many depictions of the language network, dorsal stream in blue and the ventral stream in red. And you could look at the right hemisphere and say that's the weak shadow in adults. And so when you have a stroke in the left hemisphere, there's a reweighting of the network, and that results in increased reliance on what's left of this network in the right hemisphere. So the idea here is there is still a bihemispheric network in adults, and after a stroke, we're just reweighting the network to increase the reliance on the right hemisphere. And the difference in babies is that the network is more symmetric, and so it's easier to do this reweighting, and it's more effective in the right hemisphere in babies. So there's one hypothesis, a developmentally inspired hypothesis about right hemisphere plasticity in aphasia, and this should be compensatory. So this should contribute positively to aphasia outcomes to the extent that people can take advantage of it. Another feature of this hypothesis, which has been implied in the literature for a long time, is that a larger stroke will result in more reliance on the right hemisphere. And the reason for that is that this process would occur through a network reweighting, and that should only really be necessary if there's severe network disruption in the left hemisphere, which would relate to the size of the lesion. Now, there are alternative hypotheses in the adult literature on stroke recovery for right hemisphere activity to the extent that we see it. One of the most prominent is the idea of recruitment of domain general processors, or the multi-demand network, if you want to call it that. And the idea here is that if you lose part of the language network, communication is more effortful and more resources are needed. And so other networks that aren't strictly speaking involved in language get recruited in either to help with the cognitive demand of language, or maybe to take on actual language processes themselves. And it happens that some of these, like the ventral attention network, are very nearby to language areas and could easily be mistaken for language areas in the right hemisphere. And again, this should be a compensatory process where this kind of plasticity should relate to better than expected language outcomes, given the severity of the stroke. Now, a third prominent hypothesis is the idea that actually the right hemisphere recruitment, to the extent that we see it in results, is counterproductive. And this derives from the interhemispheric inhibition hypothesis. This is borrowed from the motor literature, where the two hemispheres, motor cortices, are mutually inhibiting each other, and that helps with bimanual coordination. So they're locked in this battle of inhibition, and the idea here is that the language network is too, and particularly in the frontal lobes. But in the case of language, the left hemisphere is winning, and so the left hemisphere is suppressing the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is trying to suppress the left hemisphere, but it can't because it's weaker. And then when you have a stroke, particularly to the left frontal lobe, you lose that left to right inhibition, and that allows the right hemisphere to dominate. So activity increases, it feeds back on the left hemisphere and makes the situation worse because now it's inhibiting any of that perilesional tissue that might contribute to aphasia recovery. So in this case, there's increased right hemisphere activity. It should be contralateral. It should be across from where the lesion is where you should see increased activity. Should relate to decreased activity in the left. So the less activity in the left, the more activity in the right, and it should be counterproductive for recovery based on this hypothesis. Okay, now aside from the very, very long-term goal of curing aphasia, this is all relevant because we have these techniques to modestly modulate network function in people with aphasia. TMS and TDCS. There's been a lot of attention over the past, say, 10 to 15 years on TDCS. And so we've seen a lot of papers on that in the aphasia world. But actually, if you look at the literature as a whole, as this meta-analysis did, the largest amount of research and the best evidence for ways to modulate the network to improve aphasia recovery is through inhibition of the right inferior frontal gyrus using RTMS. So low frequency RTMS results in decreased cortical excitability. If you do that to the right hemisphere inferior frontal gyrus for about 2 weeks, you can see some modest improvements in naming and in overall aphasia severity across a pretty large number of studies altogether. We need a phase 3 multi-site randomized trial to prove that this is true. In the motor recovery literature, this was the state of the literature for a long time, where it seemed like contralesional inhibition of motor cortex improved motor recovery, and then a seminal multi-site phase 3 randomized trial showed no effect. So we need to prove this. But this suggests that maybe there's something to that interhemispheric inhibition hypothesis, and that suppressing the right hemisphere, at least in the infrafrontal gyrus, is a good strategy. But it doesn't have to be that just one of these hypotheses is true. So this is a case report that I published with Roy and with Branch Coslett, who was my other postdoc mentor back when I was at Penn. This was a participant in one of those RTMS trials where we were inhibiting the right hemisphere. And the top line shows her lesion in an MP RAGE. The arrow is where we inhibited using the TMS. The middle shows the fMRI activity immediately before versus after the first session of our TMS. So the blue shows that we did inhibit the right inferior frontal gyrus as planned. There was no increased activity in the left inferior frontal gyrus, which is what one would have hoped to see. But she did improve behaviorally, at least in terms of naming, from this treatment. Now, unfortunately for this woman, a few months later, she had a second stroke, this time in the right hemisphere. And you can see that in the bottom slide. This is a diffusion-weighted image showing the acute stroke damage. It was a watershed ischemic stroke. So it undercut the white matter of the cortex in the right hemisphere. So now we have, unfortunately for this lady, 2 different types of right hemisphere inhibition, and we can see how each of them affected the behavioral outcome. One, a modest inhibition focally from TMS, and one, a broader, let's call it disruption instead of inhibition from a second stroke. So here I've z-normalized her test scores across a range of behaviors. The gray bar shows the sort of normal range corrected for multiple comparisons. I'm highlighting two important columns here. This is the effect of RTMS. A few weeks after we finished treatment, there was improvement in her Boston naming test score, in the number of different words on picture description, and on the Click-It composite language score, she improved. So we saw improvement from inhibiting the right inferior frontal gyrus. But then after her right hemisphere stroke, a month or two later, I think, this is what happened. So now her scores have dropped, and in particular, in those same scores that increased the most after the TMS. So you never expect a right hemisphere stroke to have the biggest effect on language, but that was the case across the Click-It domains for this woman, suggesting that the right hemisphere had taken on some language function for her. And we saw a big decrease in her naming ability in particular. So now this suggests that there may be multiple things going on in the right hemisphere. It may not just be one story in adults. There may be different mechanisms of plasticity that account for right hemisphere changes. All right, so when I started my own lab, we started doing some fMRI work on this. We were using picture naming at the time, and a postdoc in the lab, Laura Skipper-Kalal, who it's been a difficult year for the lab. She also passed away earlier this year, very unexpectedly. We miss her. But she did a couple of studies looking at the relationship of lesion location in the left hemisphere and right hemisphere activation in this picture naming task. And in one of these studies, we looked at the motor cortex. And what we found was if we compared people whose lesions left the motor cortex spared in the left hemisphere versus those where the motor cortex was lesioned in the left hemisphere, we saw increased right hemisphere activity in, right motor cortex, but only when the left motor cortex was lesioned. And when we looked at the relationship of that activity to naming outcomes, what we found was after controlling for lesion volume and demographics and other things, in people whose left motor cortex was spared, there was no relationship between right motor cortex activity and naming ability. But in the people who had a lesion in their left motor cortex, there was a nice strong relationship where the more they were using their right motor cortex, the better their naming ability. So now this looks like a compensatory increase, could be interhemispheric inhibition without the feedback, or it could be another mechanism. We were proposing at the time competition for subcortical synapses from the motor cortex. So here we have contralesional, directly across from the lesion, increased activity that helps with outcomes. In the same data set, we also looked at the temporal lobe using a slightly different set of analyses. And here we found something similar and sort of different as well. So this time comparing control participants to people with aphasia, we found increased activity in this part of the right superior temporal sulcus. And the degree to which people were using this area related to their naming ability. Again, taking out lesion size, in this case, lesion location also, and other demographic factors. So here again, we have increased activity in the right hemisphere in our people with aphasia compared to controls, and it seems to be contributing to outcomes. Now, the interesting thing here is that this finding related very differently to lesion location than the motor cortex finding. So it turned out that the lesions that were driving this increased right temporal lobe activity were actually in the frontal lobe, in the dorsal inferior frontal gyrus. And when people had lesions directly opposite this area in the left temporal lobe, they were not able to take advantage of the right superior temporal sulcus to help with their recovery. So now this looks like a different mechanism. You can't explain this based on the same mechanism as the first one, unless you think, well, maybe it's just frontal lesions and it isn't actually about interhemispheric inhibition or compensation by similar nodes in the two hemispheres, but it's something about lesions in the frontal lobe that just result in use of the right hemisphere. Okay. Now, another thing to point out about all of this is these changes are very modest. This is nothing like what we see in the babies where they're just using the right hemisphere like you and I would use the left hemisphere. These are modest changes to the right hemisphere activity, and you have to look at them carefully. All right, so all of this left us with a lot of questions. And I'm going to lay a bunch of them out here. So first question is the right hemisphere activity that we see increased in chronic left hemisphere stroke? Does that actually occur if we account for task performance? All the data that I've shown you so far has been contaminated by this question of differences in task performance between people with aphasia and controls, or different severities of aphasia. So if we account for that, will we still see these increases in the right hemisphere? Is it real plasticity, or is it an artifact of how we're measuring it? Now, the kids show very robust activity in the right hemisphere. Adults do not. So do we see a decline gradually over the course of our lifetime, or is it an abrupt change where adults of any age will have this same pattern? They struggle to use the right hemisphere for language. And then from Dorothy's work, does it decrease over time after stroke? Is it most helpful early and less helpful later? And then the big question for me for developing new treatments is, how is this happening? What's the mechanism? So is it upregulation of the weak shadow through compensation, through network sort of reweighting and compensation? Is it recruitment of new right hemisphere lesions for language, like domain general processors, if you want to call it that get pulled into the language network? Is it a release of transcallosal inhibition that may or may not be good for outcomes? And then I raised this last question at the end. There's some evidence growing that maybe the right hemisphere recruitment only occurs with left frontal lesions, and that's the common denominator of who's using the right hemisphere. And then the most important question maybe is whether any of this matters for recovery. We've seen hints that it does, but those were in tasks that were confounded by task performance. Okay. Now, because I'm impatient and a little bit obsessive sometimes, we decided to address all of these questions in one paper. And so we just published that paper earlier this month, I guess, or last month, maybe. And here were the co-authors on the paper, Kelly Martin, that amazing PhD student I mentioned, who's now a postdoc, my collaborator and former postdoc, Andrew DeMarco, who has the lab next door now, and Alicia Lux, our senior research speech pathologist. And here's what we did. We got a group together of 77 chronic left hemisphere stroke survivors. We ended up throwing out a number of people who couldn't do our fMRI task. So it's a relatively mild group, but there are people with very significant aphasia in here. And we have a large group of matched controls, which is, I think, really important. So they're matched on demographic factors, age, education, primarily, and gender, too. And for this, we're going to use Stephen Wilson's adaptive semantic decision task. So if you are not familiar with this task, what the person in the scanner is doing is they're looking at two words, and they have to say whether they're related to each other in meaning. And then in the control condition, they're looking at these pseudo font strings, and they have to say whether the strings are identical to each other. And the key thing about this task is it gets harder and easier depending on how you're doing. So it keeps everybody off ceiling. Even control subjects can't get to 100% on this task. It makes everybody work hard to do the task. And so now we hopefully have accounted for these task performance confounds that I mentioned. And Stephen has shown that this task also produces very, very reliable single subject activation that's strongly left lateralized, both in people who are neurologically healthy and in people with aphasia after stroke. And I can tell you that he's not kidding. We have scanned people with this task 4 or 5 years apart, and the maps look practically identical. It's really quite a remarkable task for producing single subject reliable maps. Okay. So the first thing that we did was we needed to define the right hemisphere language network. And so we pulled out 20 of our control subjects, and we looked at their activity on their own, and it looks like this. It activates canonical frontal and temporal language areas and the angular gyrus. And it also activates a bunch of other areas that we would think of as being involved in the semantic and the executive aspects of the task, probably. And so we're going to focus in, for the sake of understanding the symmetric right hemisphere language activity, on the canonical language areas in the temporal lobe, lateral temporal lobe, and in the inferior frontal gyrus. So we flipped this activity over to the right hemisphere. We used a cluster dividing algorithm that we came up with to divide it into pieces, and we ended up with 11 different ROIs in the lateral temporal lobe, the angular gyrus, and 5 in the inferior frontal gyrus, spanning basically the entire inferior frontal gyrus. And we're going to focus all of our analyses on these ROIs and what happens to the activity in them. Now, before doing that, it's important to note that the level of activity in these right hemisphere areas varied in our held out controls. And so some of these areas were pretty active. And those were the ventral nodes, particularly in the mid to anterior temporal lobe and in the ventral inferior frontal gyrus, and to a lesser degree in the posterior STS and MTG. So these were areas that were already weakly active for language. They're probably weak nodes in the bihemispheric language network, and so we would call them the weak shadow in the terminology that we've been using in our lab. And there's other nodes, and very notably the dorsal inferior frontal gyrus, that are not engaged in this task at all in the right hemisphere. And in fact, the most dorsal part of the inferior frontal gyrus in the pars opercularis was actually underactivated for the task. So this wouldn't survive in a group map, you wouldn't find deactivation. But if you look across individuals, there's fairly reliable, mild, decreased activity compared to the control condition. So it may be that this is a so-called domain general or executive processor, or whatever you want to call it, that's not involved in language before stroke. And the slightly more ventral area in the pars triangularis, dorsal pars triangularis, was just completely neutral. It activated the same for language as it did for non-language tasks, or maybe it didn't activate for either. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go forward. Okay, first question is there a difference in the right hemisphere activity? Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped one thing, which is the task performance. Okay, so before we look at any of the data, the task is adaptive, and the goal was to equate effort and hopefully performance. I think it does a good job of equating effort, and unfortunately did not equate task performance. This is a comparison between the control participants and the stroke survivors in the accuracy on the semantic decision task, and you can see that the control participants were more active than the stroke survivors, and then there was no difference in the pseudofond control task. So stroke patients can't do this task as well. And the task performance was also related to lesion size. So the larger the lesion, the worse our people with aphasia did on the semantic decision task. But again, there was no relationship with the pseudofond control. So this was a little disappointing. And what we did was we just threw in the task performance, the accuracy on the task, into all of our analyses to try to address any residual performance confounds. So there's one analysis where we didn't do this that I'll point out later, but all the analyses in the beginning, we've accounted for task performance. All right, first big question, does the right hemisphere language network increase in activity after a left hemisphere stroke? And the answer is yes, a little. So this is from a big mixed effects model comparing activity across all of the ROIs between all of our stroke participants and our control participants, and including task performance, including age, education, handedness, gender, and the answer is there is a statistically significant P of 0.03, I think it was, difference between the groups where the stroke survivors are activating the right hemisphere language network more. Now, it's important to look at this distribution, and you can see that most of the stroke survivors are in the same range as the control subjects, but there's a higher clustering at the top. So the bottom line here is that it's not everybody who seems to be using the right hemisphere more than control subjects. One other important note here is that we did not screen the language laterality of our control subjects before, and there's left-handers and right-handers in this cohort. And it happens that this control subject and this control subject are both left-handed, and they're weakly right lateralized for language, but we didn't throw them out. So if we take them out of the equation, There's actually 14 of our stroke survivors who have more right hemisphere activity overall than all of the other control subjects. So there seems to be a subgroup who are using the right hemisphere more. Now, just for more perspective, these increases are really modest. So here's the right hemisphere and here's the left hemisphere on the same scale. So activity overall is still much larger in the left hemisphere, even for people who have a stroke in the left hemisphere. And we did not take out lesion voxels here. So even accounting for that, there's still more activity in the left hemisphere. One other quick point about this is it looks like there's decreased activity in the left hemisphere, but actually, if you control for task performance, this is only marginal. This is like a P of 0.08, I think, or 0.09 difference in the left hemisphere if you account for task performance. Okay, just to show you, these are the other areas that we pulled out that were outside of the canonical language areas in the executive semantic areas, and there were no differences in either hemisphere in those areas in activity. So the increases in the right seem to be relatively specific to these canonical language areas. It was not the same across all the nodes. So this is a heat map. The darker blue is showing where the biggest effects were. And the biggest effects in our stroke group were in the dorsal inferior frontal gyrus. So those were the areas where across the group we saw the biggest increases in activity, and in the IFG in general going ventrally. And I'll just remind you that these two hotspots, these were the ones that were really significantly different than controls, are two that were not involved in language in this task beforehand. So this now looks like maybe pulling on some new nodes into the language network, at least based on this task. Then it was important to understand who it was that were using the right hemisphere more. And so we looked at all of our covariates. First thing to say is lesion size does not matter at all here. It is not the case in our hands that larger lesions result in more use of the right hemisphere. We also found that, at least cross-sectionally, the longer a person was from their stroke, everyone was 6 months or more, so, and this goes out for years and years and years. The longer a person out from stroke was, the more they were using their right hemisphere. The big thing was age. In the age range of 30-something to 80-something, there was a big decrease in use of right hemisphere over age. It's important to know that we also looked at this in controls in separate work that hasn't been published yet, and we don't find any age-related changes in laterality of fMRI activity, of structural connectivity, of functional connectivity in this network in our control subjects. So this is something that maybe is specific about recovery from stroke and isn't just a change in laterality with age. Handedness, of course, matters. Left-handers use the right hemisphere more. And education, more education, more right hemisphere activity. Maybe that has to do with the nature of the task. Okay, next question. Is it transcallosal inhibition that accounts for these changes? We looked at this in two ways. The first hypothesis is that if it's transcallosal inhibition, you should see greater right hemisphere activity when you have a lesion symmetric to the node that you're looking at. So we looked across all the nodes, and we did find across all the nodes collectively that when you have a left hemisphere lesion at the same location, you'll have increased activity in that spot in the right hemisphere. And this is the heat map of where those effects were. And interestingly, they were mostly in these ventral areas that we would consider part of the right hemisphere weak shadow. Now, a second aspect of the transcallosal inhibition hypothesis is that the increased activity in the right hemisphere should be related to decreasing activity in the left hemisphere. And weirdly, we thought, we saw the opposite. So in fact, the right hemisphere activity overall correlated with the left hemisphere activity. The more you activate a node in the left hemisphere, the more you also activate the contralateral node, the same contralateral node in the right hemisphere. And really interestingly, these effects were again mostly in those ventral nodes in the weak shadow. This seems really contradictory, right? A lesion here, a lesion in this left hemisphere spot causes increased right hemisphere activity, and more activity in this spot in the left hemisphere relates to more activity in the right hemisphere. Seems, seems paradoxical, but I'll explain it in a minute. Okay, so just again to remind you, these are the areas that were already kind of active in control subjects. So now we're seeing right hemisphere compensation in those weak shadow areas when we have lesions in the left hemisphere and when those left hemisphere areas are active. So let's look at that and see how we can explain that. So here we went in and we plotted the relative activity of the left hemisphere node, of each left hemisphere node and each right hemisphere node. And we did it in control subjects, in the portion of the stroke survivors who had lesions sparing that node, and in the stroke survivors who had lesions that affected that node. So the gray are the control subjects. We see a nice correlation. So where the more left hemisphere activation in this mid-temporal area, the more right hemisphere activation. And that's consistent with this node being a weak part of the language network. It's coordinating with the left hemisphere. When people have a lesion elsewhere that doesn't affect this spot in the left hemisphere, you see decreased left hemisphere activity, you see no change in right hemisphere activity, and the relationship remains the same. So this area is still coordinating with the left hemisphere. When you have a lesion in this spot in the left hemisphere, now you get a bump up in the right hemisphere activity. You get even more reduced left hemisphere activity, but the relationship stays the same. This is still part of that bihemispheric language network, but now it's just increased its role in the network. So this now looks like, I think, network compensation in that weak shadow that's sort of a weak part of the language network, not transcallosal inhibition. Okay, now, strikingly, we saw a very different pattern in those parts of the dorsal IFG that were not involved in language and controls before. So here, there's no relationship between left hemisphere dorsal IFG and right hemisphere dorsal IFG in control subjects because it's not part of the language network in this task. When you have a lesion that spares this area in the left hemisphere, now it gets yoked into the system. You have a correlation where the more activity you have in the left hemisphere, the more activity you have in the right hemisphere. And that relationship inverts when you have a lesion to the left hemisphere. Now, if you have a lesion here and you continue to activate it, you do not recruit the right hemisphere. It's when you have a lesion that inactivates this left hemisphere node that you recruit the right hemisphere. That could be transcallosal inhibition, maybe, but only under particular circumstances. So this is a complex pattern. I'm not going to pretend that we have the answers to this yet. We're going to look at some connectivity measures and other things to try and figure out whether we can explain this more completely. But the main take-home point is that there is not one single mechanism that explains recruitment of right hemisphere language homotopes in people with aphasia. Okay, now we took a second look to see are we missing anything because we've been focused on just homotopic lesions so far in hypothesis-driven analyses. So next what we did is we took each area in the right hemisphere and we ran a lesion symptom mapping analysis and asked, are there lesions in the left hemisphere that relate to increased activity in particular parts of the right hemisphere? And we found two discrete patterns. One is for these nodes, so the ventral IFG and the posterior STG. The activity in those nodes were related to lesions in the IFG and the anterior insula. So again, those frontal lesions are causing increased activity or resulting in increased activity in the corresponding area in the right hemisphere, but also the right posterior temporal lobe. So this is consistent with that Skipper-Kalal paper that I mentioned to you before. And the second pattern is what we expected to see based on the prior analyses. So anterior and mid-temporal lobe lesions in the left hemisphere result in increased reliance on the anterior and mid-temporal lobe in the right hemisphere. Okay, last question is, does any of this matter for outcomes? And the answer is yes. These are a series of partial correlations. In this case, we did not control for task performance in the paper, but the results are actually the same if you do. I checked that afterwards. And what we find is that some of these ventral areas that we consider part of the weak shadow, the more active they are, accounting for many, many different things, including lesion load at every single one of these ROIs in the left hemisphere, lesion size, all of our demographic factors, even accounting for all of that, more activity in these areas relates to somewhat better outcomes in word reading, in the WAB naming and word finding, and to some degree in a separate semantic judgment task, but not in other aspects of the WAB. Now, we stuck with the WAB here just to keep it clinically relevant. We haven't really gone in to look at a lot of other behaviors, so I can't promise that all the behaviors will act the same. I think it's sensible that these would be the behaviors that relate because this is a semantic decision task that involves reading. And so that may be the reason that we're seeing the relationships that we are with reading and naming, or it may not be. So it'll be important to look at other tasks using the same types of analyses to see if the results are consistent. Now, in the paper, we did this as partial correlations, sort of out of convenience, but I've also done this in regression models. The temporal lobe, in particular, this mid-temporal area, accounts for about 5 to 10% of variance in outcomes in word reading and naming. I think it's 5% for naming and 10% for reading, after accounting for lesion location, lesion size, demographic variables, and left hemisphere activity. So this is seemingly important for outcomes. Okay, so the grand conclusion is there is constrained right hemisphere plasticity in adults after left hemisphere stroke. It's not dramatic, it's limited. The activity in the right hemisphere increases modestly in some parts of the right hemisphere, and in some people only, it appears, at least compared to controls. And it's related to younger age. The younger members of the group were doing it more. Also, higher education, left-handedness, and particularly it's related to lesion location. We saw cross-sectionally a hint that maybe it actually increases over time, but we'll need to do longitudinal work to confirm that in the chronic period. And it modestly contributes to aphasia outcomes. And you can't account for it with just one mechanism of plasticity. We saw distinct patterns in those weak shadow areas that are likely recruited, we think, through network reweighting. And then we saw recruitment of the dorsal IFG, which was not involved in language in this task, at least. Okay, so this leads me to think about some new potential avenues for treatment. I'm going to give you a couple of near-term ideas and a couple of long-term ideas. In the near term, I think everybody's interested in individualizing our brain stimulation treatments. And so I think we could potentially think about individualizing our mode of right hemisphere stimulation based on some of the factors that we observed here. So for example, if a person maybe has a ventral lesion, like a temporal lobe lesion, and we look at the activation in the right hemisphere and we see that they're not activating those weak shadow areas, maybe we want to stimulate them to increase the activity in there and promote the network reweighting that seemed to be a little bit helpful for recovery. And then with the right hemisphere inhibition, maybe that would be best used only for certain people. So for instance, if you have a dorsal IFG lesion and you're overactivating the right dorsal IFG, maybe we want to inhibit it. Speculative, but this kind of individualization in the right hemisphere stimulation, where sometimes you might want to excite and sometimes you might want to inhibit, seems like the way to go. And in the very long term, I would like us to move towards developing methods that dramatically enhance brain plasticity, ideally transiently and focally in certain parts of the right hemisphere. So maybe combinations of medications. There's some exciting work on gamma stimulation that might be suggestive that that will help. And that's going to have to be paired with long-term training to relearn language during windows of enhanced plasticity. It takes babies a couple of years to learn language. If we're going to make the brain much more plastic again, we should expect that it might take years also of therapy to really, really dramatically improve aphasia. Okay, so that's what I had to say. I want to thank again my my group and my collaborators for all of their work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I want to start by just extending our condolences for the great losses that you had recently.
Thank you.
All right. We have time for a couple of questions, maybe starting with the room here, if we have any questions.
Sure.
William?
Hey, Peter, this is William Matchin. Thank you so much for the talk. It's a very interesting area and a lot to think about. So I was actually really interested in that dorsal right IFG. You know, there's a lot of other research implicating that region in stopping or response inhibition. And so I don't know what your thoughts are in that regard, but I think it converges in some sense with a lot of what you're saying. I think it's an interesting dissociation, right? That region, it sort of makes sense. There's a sort of story that I think kind of fits together. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Just to say that I agree, I think that's an interesting thought. It's something that Roy and Branch and I used to talk about with the TMS work, that maybe that's how it's working for TMS, is it's reducing the, as you call it, stopping or response inhibition, and just promoting more speech basically in that way. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think, I wouldn't want to say that that's the case from our findings alone, but I think it's an interesting hypothesis and, worth exploring.
All right, we do have a couple of questions online. So you can read the first one out. This one is from Turkeltaub. Thanks for an excellent talk. And moving tribute to Celeste, what are your thoughts about potential pre-morbid inter-individual variance, strength or weight of the right hemisphere shadow of language supporting activation? There are a couple of other questions. What factors might affect how strong that shadow is in healthy adults? And which such factors then also help to predict the impact of the stroke or potential for recovery?
Yeah, thanks, Dirk. Those are important questions. Yes, I think there is going to be variability. The most obvious answer is handedness. There's a proportion of left-handers who will rely more on the right hemisphere than most right-handers do. And we saw that in our results, both in controls and in the stroke survivors. The handedness was related to the degree of right hemisphere activity. So I think that's the most obvious one. But there may be other factors as well. So increased education results in richer semantic representations. We think semantic representations are relatively more bilateral, maybe lexical representations too. And so that could relate to more use of the right hemisphere before the stroke. I think those are very important factors. Maybe age, we haven't seen it in our data, but maybe age as well would be a factor. I'd have to speculate, but I do think, just like in other areas of medicine, our goal is to predict who's going to respond to what kind of treatment. What are the risks of, I don't know, atrial fibrillation for stroke, and we gauge that based on risk factors at a population level. And so it's all going to be probabilistic. And I think you're thinking exactly the way I'm thinking, that we should be finding personal attributes that would be predictive of how much a person might use the right hemisphere or how much they can't, and guide our treatments based on those probabilities. And to the extent that we can measure, specific right hemisphere use in individual people, that's even better. But in some cases, it may be based on probabilities, based on personal features that relate to it.
Perfect. Thank you. And on that note, we have a somewhat related question from Kirana Tapkini. She says, great presentation, Peter. What do you think about the claim that there's a shift to bilateral involvement later in life for language? Is this the reverse pattern of developmental changes? And also, are there any neuromodulation studies in which we inhibit the left hemisphere to allow for the right hemisphere to arise to the situation and reveal its potential without having to inhibit the left hemisphere?
Thanks, Karana. Interesting questions. So I would say that when I've reviewed the literature on changes in laterality in the language network over age, with the idea that it becomes more bilateral, I have not really seen compelling evidence in the literature that makes me think that happens. And also, if you think about it, at least in the way that I think we would naturally think about laterality of language, if that were the case, we would expect a left hemisphere stroke to cause less aphasia in older people, potentially, unless it's compensation that's driving the right hemisphere recruitment, which is one of the hypotheses. So I haven't seen compelling evidence that there are major changes in laterality of language activity. There are some studies that show that, but those studies are, I think, using fMRI tasks that are contaminated by a lot of executive function and cognitive control demands, where there's a little bit better evidence that you need more bilateral tissue to support those functions with age. But more research, of course. Inhibiting the left hemisphere to allow the right hemisphere to rise for vision. I have not seen a study that's tried that. I think how an IRB would feel about that. It's an interesting idea. I mean, you know, in the kids that Alyssa's group is studying, there are hints that maybe it's better just to completely flip to the right hemisphere than to try to use both hemispheres. But I don't take that as fact. That's just hints we've seen a little bit along the way. So maybe, I mean, I don't know. It's not, there's no crazy ideas. Maybe that could help, but it certainly hasn't been tried as far as I know.
Perfect, thank you. Maybe one quick one. I think that's the last question we have here. There was one question from Fedorenko, which I think you addressed.
I did, yeah. Yeah, Ev, thanks for the question. It does. We looked at that. I think Stephen asked me to do that after the fact, and it does still relate after accounting for the left hemisphere. I know. So I'm only looking at symmetric areas in the left and the right, I think, when I did that. So I could look at all the left hemisphere activity, but I don't think it'll matter. I think the right hemisphere is contributing independently there.
All right, thank you. And then for the last question, I think you can see it, but I'll read it for the audience. This one is from Brent the Rap. Interesting, the recruitment of the dorsal IFG. Could it be that it is actually a part of the language network that you did not identify that your localizer task, which is strictly lexical, which may not recruit the full language network?
Yep, I totally agree, Brenda. I mean, everything about this you have to interpret in the context of this task, which, you know, questionably language. There's lots of other language functions that aren't tapped by this task. So one of our next goals is to gather multiple tasks in individual people and compare, ideally, you know, syntax, receptive and productive, and using this task as a comparison. If we can do that, I think that's going to be really, really important.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Peter. So
yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So this brings us to the end of today's talk. Thank you so much to our online audience for watching, our in-person audience, and to Peter as our presenter. And we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you so much.